And I invite you to take a moment to think about a time when you were with family and someone pulled out the family stories, the lore, the legends of your grandparents, a distant cousin your mother promises you know but you can't remember, or a story from when you were a child that is barely there in your memory. And for many families, the telling of these stories is just as important a part of the gathering as the gathering itself. It becomes almost ritualized that we tell and retell these stories. And when we tell and retell a story, especially when we retell a story, it takes on a life of its own. And it grows. Maybe certain parts are exaggerated. Maybe it changes depending on which grandparent is doing the telling. Or we find ourselves listening harder or placing emphasis on a different part of the story, depending on the current moment that we're in. Stories connect us to our past, but they also help us understand our present. Family stories, in particular, remind us where we've come from, our culture, our heritage, our religion, our personal traditions. These stories often serve to demonstrate something important in our family structures or values. We cook the meal this particular way because that's how great Aunt so-and-so used to do it. We play this particular game when we get together because that's what our grandparents did. And without this context, some of these traditions might seem strange. And indeed, I bet most of us have a memory of bringing a friend or a partner to a family gathering who stared on in bewilderment at us doing something that seemed perhaps perfectly normal if you were on the inside. And sharing family stories and traditions is not just about recording the history, because remembering what happened and what happened alone would make for quite dull dinner conversation. But remembering how we felt, how we laughed or cried, how the soup was burned beyond recognition and all the takeaway places happened to be closed that night, those parts of the story are what build connection between us and between our past selves. So understanding that past, both individually and collectively, helps us better understand our present. Tomorrow morning, we will close the book of Genesis. We'll read the final chapters, and our Parsha, Vayechi, concludes the book of Genesis, and it details the end of Jacob, the patriarch's life. He is now an old man. He calls his children to him and offers them each blessings and, in some cases, backhanded compliments before he dies. His sons carry him up from Egypt and bury him in the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob's wife Leah are buried. Rachel is buried somewhere else in Bethlehem. Joseph, his son, also ages, and the Parsha concludes with his death and a promise that Jacob's family will one day leave Egypt. And this Parsha serves as a transition point between the family story and the national story of the Jewish people. Throughout Genesis, we have followed the matriarchs and patriarchs on their journeys, witnessed the tension and strife in their families, seen the consequences of paternal favoritism and the reconciliation across multiple generations. Genesis introduces us to the family of Israel with all of its joys and sorrow. Next week, when we start the book of Exodus, we will begin reading the story of the nation of Israel. And our commentaries ask, why did the Torah start at creation and not at the story of Abraham, the first Jewish person? Why does the Torah include the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and not simply begin at the book of Exodus? Why does the Torah include the story at the beginning of Exodus with the Israelites suffering enslavement, the 10 plagues, and leaving Egypt? Why not simply begin at Mount Sinai with the receiving of the 10 Commandments and the covenant with God that truly makes them the people Israel? Without the stories in Genesis, without the stories of early Exodus, of enslavement and freedom, the rest of the Torah would not hold the same power and meaning for us. The Torah will later remind us multiple times not to oppress the stranger, reminding us that we were slaves and oppressed in Egypt. Remembering our past by telling that part of the story gives more meaning to this commandment, as we are no longer dealing with a theoretical case, but rather calling forth empathy based on our own experiences. The Torah later will tell us not to cheat at business, to have honest weights and measures, not to lie or to steal. And how much more powerful these stories are, these laws, when we set them in conversation with the story of Jacob taking Esau's birthright and blessing, leading to countless years of estrangement between them. Or knowing that Jacob's father-in-law will trick him into marrying the wrong sister, condemning Leah to a marriage with a man who does not love her. The Torah's instructions for how to live in harmony with our families and communities carry more weight when they're contextualized within the dysfunction that we see in Genesis. And in order to tell the national story of the Jewish people, we must first tell these familial stories, because it is in those personal and intimate moments in Genesis and early in the book of Exodus that we gain an understanding of why the Torah cares so deeply about how we treat one another. In order to understand why the Israelites set out to conquer Canaan, we must first understand the deep connection they feel to their ancestral land. In order to understand why they are punished for behaving badly once in the land of Canaan, we must first witness their oppression and God instructing them not to repeat that treatment on others. And how we tell the story might be just as important as the history itself. The Torah could have begun the story of the Jewish people at the conquering of the land of Canaan. It could have begun at Mount Sinai when the people make a covenant with God. It could have begun with the Exodus itself. It could have even begun with a simple man named Abram who follows God to an unknown land. But instead, it begins with the universal story, the creation of the world. The commentaries ask, why begin at creation? To teach us that no person is greater than another, for we all come from the same ancestor, Adam, the first human. The Torah begins our story, the Jewish story, rooted in humility and compassion for others. It begins by reminding us that we are connected to everyone else on earth, to the natural world and creation itself. It begins our story by asking us to actually just wait a moment for our part in the tale to come, and to start by telling a universal story. Because how we tell the story and where we begin it teaches us something about what matters. Today, when we want to know the answer to something, we can pull out our phones and ask the internet. We can get a short and simple version without having to read or research much further than a headline or a quick summary. And this may allow us to find the answer quickly, but it takes away the opportunity to contextualize that answer within a greater scope. We may learn the what, but we lose the chance to understand the why. The Torah asks us to slow down, to read deeper and more broadly, to not demand or expect an immediate answer, to recognize that we cannot tell the story of the Jewish people fully without telling the messy family stories of Jacob's 12 sons, of Esau's stolen blessing, of Ishmael and his mother Hagar being banished. We do not shy away from the chapters where our ancestors behave poorly or make choices that we question and struggle with. In order to truly understand ourselves as the Jewish people, we must tell the proverbial awkward or dark family stories, including that of Jacob favoring one of his wives or Joseph's brothers selling him into slavery. Because how we tell the story teaches us what matters. The Torah shows us deeply flawed people who also possess a deep capacity for compassion and change, for growth and learning. It shows us characters who try and fail and try again. It shows us humility and ego side by side, strength and suffering, oppression into freedom. And as we close the story of Jacob's family tomorrow and look ahead to next week's introduction of the Israelite nation, let us remember some of these lessons from Genesis. That the Jewish people started off as a big and sometimes dysfunctional family, And sometimes to this day, we still behave that way. That we should approach each other with curiosity about the stories that brought each of us personally to our present paths. And that though sometimes the characters in the Torah make mistakes, just as we make them every day of our lives, there is a constant thread of belief and hope that tomorrow we can be better than we were the day before. Shabbat Shalom.